He threw her out on Christmas Eve while she was 7 months pregnant, replaced her with an Instagram model, called her worthless because she only made $47,000 a year as a teacher. He thought he had upgraded to a better life. What he didn't know, his poor ex-wife was secretly running a $3.6 billion empire the entire marriage. And the divorce he rushed through, it finalized exactly 8 days before she inherited everything. 8 days that cost him $1.8 billion. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about a woman who stayed silent, documented everything, and waited for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. Stay until the end. You won't believe how she made him pay. And if stories like this keep you hooked, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe. You don't want to miss what happens next. The glass windows of the penthouse reflected the Seattle skyline like a mirror. Grace Holland stood at her desk, reviewing quarterly reports on 3 monitors. Her phone buzzed. Wall Street Journal calling? She let it go to voicemail. They wanted a comment on her latest acquisition, a $200 million deal she'd closed before breakfast. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, she had a different life to return to. Grace changed out of her tailored suit and into worn jeans and a sweater from Target. She removed her diamond earrings and replaced them with simple studs. The transformation took 15 minutes. From billionaire CEO to community college art teacher. From G. Holland, founder of Holland Capital, to Grace Morrison, wife of Brett. Her husband of 8 years had no idea. She'd built her empire in secret, started at 21 with $50,000 in code she'd written in her college dorm room. Algorithmic trading software that predicted market patterns with 87% accuracy. Within 3 years, she turned that $50,000 into $10 million. By 30, she'd crossed the billion-dollar threshold. Now, at 36 and 7 months pregnant, she managed $3.2 billion in assets, and Brett thought she made $47,000 a year teaching painting classes. Grace locked her penthouse office and drove across town to the modest townhouse she shared with her husband, the house she'd bought with cash under an LLC, then pretended to rent with him. Everything was strategy. Everything was a test Brett was failing. She'd met him in graduate school. He'd been charming, ambitious, driven. She'd fallen for his confidence, his plans, his dreams of building something meaningful. So she'd hidden her growing wealth. She'd used her mother's maiden name, Bennett, for her teaching job. She'd wanted to know if he could love her without the money corrupting everything. For the first few years, it worked. Brett had been kind, present. They'd talked about art and philosophy and building a life together. But somewhere around year 5, something shifted. He became obsessed with status, with luxury brands and expensive restaurants, and keeping up with the influencers he followed online. He started making comments about her clothes, her car, her lack of ambition. He'd ask why she was satisfied teaching at a community college when she could be doing something more impressive. He'd sigh when she suggested cooking dinner at home instead of going out. He'd scroll through Instagram during their conversations, double-tapping photos of other people's supposedly perfect lives. Grace had watched it happen like watching a slow-motion car crash. She'd documented everything. Screenshots of his likes on provocative photos, records of unexplained charges on his credit card, times he'd come home late smelling like perfume that wasn't hers. She'd been planning her exit strategy for 6 months. Tonight, she'd decided, would be different. Tonight she'd tell him the truth. Give their marriage one final chance. Show him who she really was and see if the man she'd married was still in there somewhere. Grace pulled into the driveway at 6:15. Christmas lights blinked along the roofline. She'd spent the afternoon decorating while Brett was at work. The tree stood in the corner of the living room, covered in ornaments they'd collected over the years. Sugar cookies cooled on the kitchen counter. Everything was ready for the conversation that would change everything. She walked inside and stopped. Brett stood in the living room with 2 rolling suitcases. A woman Grace had never seen before stood beside him. Young, maybe 28, with professionally styled blonde hair and an outfit that screamed expensive Instagram aesthetic. The woman's hand rested possessively on one of the suitcases. Grace's first thought was absurdly practical. She'd just paid the mortgage. Now this. Brett, she said slowly, what's going on? Her husband looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, dismissive, like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person he'd promised to love forever. Grace, we need to talk, he said. Actually, no, I'm done talking. I'm done pretending. The blonde woman stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Hi, she said brightly. I'm Sienna Vale. I'm sorry this is awkward, but Brett and I have been together for 6 months now. We're in love. Grace's hand went instinctively to her swollen belly. The baby kicked as if sensing her distress. She looked at Brett, waiting for him to say this was a joke, some kind of terrible prank. But his face remained hard and certain. Pack your things, Brett said. Sienna's moving in tonight. This is her house now. Grace felt the room tilt sideways. My house, she said. Brett, this is my house. My name is on the deed. He shrugged. Community property. Babe, my lawyer says I'm entitled to half of everything. And honestly, you should be thanking me. The words made no sense. Thanking him for what? For taking you this far. Brett continued. Let's be real. Grace, you were nobody when I met you. A grad student with an art degree living in that apartment with the broken heater. I built this life. I made you somebody. That's worth something. Sienna pulled out her phone and started filming. Moving into my new place, she said to the camera, her voice sugary sweet. Christmas miracles are real. You guys. Hashtag new beginnings. Hashtag blessed life. Grace watched this happen as if from very far away. The cookies on the counter, the tree lights blinking, her husband's face, cold and strange. This woman, this stranger, filming her humiliation for social media. Brett pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. Divorce papers, he said, holding them out. My lawyer says you have 30 days to sign. I'm being generous. I'll let you have $5,000 and you can keep your car. But this house, the furniture, everything else, that's mine. Well, ours now. He put his arm around Sienna's shoulders. The gesture was performative, deliberate, like he wanted Grace to see how easily he could replace her. Grace's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with shaking hands. Unknown number. The text message read, your father collapsed. St. Mary's Hospital. Portland. Heart attack. Critical condition. Come now. My father, oh, Grace said, her voice breaking. He's dying. Brett sighed with theatrical impatience. Sarah, I'm sorry, but that's not my problem anymore. You need to leave tonight. Sienna's parents are coming for Christmas brunch tomorrow, and it would be really uncomfortable if you were still here. Wait, Sienna said, looking up from her phone with an expression of delighted shock. Babe, you're making her leave on Christmas Eve. She turned to Brett. That's so savage. I love it. Grace stood there, 7 months pregnant, hand on her swollen belly, looking at the man she'd loved for 8 years. The man who'd just thrown her away like garbage on the most sacred night of the year. She could tell him right now, could say the words that would change everything. But she didn't. Instead, she walked slowly to the bedroom they'd shared. She pulled her suitcase from the closet. She packed her clothes, her photos, the few things that were undeniably hers. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she whispered, I know, sweetheart, I know. When she returned to the living room, Brett and Sienna were already rearranging furniture, taking down Grace's artwork, replacing it with ring lights and a backdrop wall covered in fake flowers. At the door, Grace turned back. You're right, Brett, she said quietly. He looked up, surprised. Thank you for showing me exactly who you are. She continued. I'll sign the papers. You win. Brett's smile was triumphant. That's the smartest thing you've ever said. Grace walked out into the snowy Seattle night, alone, pregnant, heartbroken. But she was also Grace Holland, founder and CEO of Holland Capital. And Brett Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The red-eye flight from Seattle to Portland lasted 45 minutes but felt like hours. Grace sat in coach, cramped and uncomfortable, her pregnant belly pressed against the tray table. She'd booked a ticket on a credit card she kept separate from her real accounts. $287 she couldn't afford on a teacher's salary. But her father was dying, and despite 15 years of strained silence, she had to see him. Thomas Holland lay in the ICU at St. Mary's Hospital, pale and still. Tubes snaked from his arms. Machines beeped steadily, monitoring a heart that had built a lumber empire and pushed away his only daughter after her mother died. A woman in her 60s stood from the chair beside the bed. "Grace," she said softly, "I've been trying to reach you for months." "Hello, Margaret," Grace replied. Margaret Ross had been Grace's confidential business attorney and manager since the beginning, the only person who knew the full truth about both her lives. She'd been at Grace's mother's funeral 20 years ago. She'd helped Grace set up her first LLC at 21. She'd witnessed every painful milestone. "I didn't think he wanted to hear from me," Grace said, moving to her father's bedside. "Your father's been following your life." Margaret said, "He knows about Brett. He knows about the baby." He paused. "He updated his will last month." Grace's hand tightened on the bed rail. "I don't want his money. It's not about wanting. Your father's lumber business is worth $80 million. In his will, you're the sole heir." "But Grace, there's a legal complication." "Of course there was." Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Washington State Community Property Law. Any assets acquired during marriage are split 50-50 in divorce. If your father dies while you're still legally married to Brett and you inherit, Brett could claim half of your inheritance as marital assets. We're talking $40 million. Grace's legs gave out. She sank into the chair. "But I'm filing for divorce," she whispered, "which takes 6 months minimum to finalize in Washington. Your father could pass any day. If he dies before your divorce is final, Brett wins the lottery." Outside the window, the sky was turning pink. Christmas morning, somewhere, families were opening presents. Children were laughing. People who loved each other were holding each other close. "What do I do?" Grace asked. Margaret sat across from her, expression grave. "Two options. 1, renounce your inheritance. Walk away from everything. 2, delay the divorce. Keep Brett legally bound to you until your father either recovers or the divorce finalizes safely. But that means 6 months of pretending to be the poor, pathetic ex-wife while secretly managing a $3 billion empire." Grace looked at her unconscious father. The man who'd chosen grief and isolation over his daughter after losing his wife. The man who'd let 15 years pass in stubborn silence. The man who was still trying to protect her from beyond consciousness. But he was also the man who'd apparently been watching her from afar. Who knew about her marriage, her pregnancy, her life? Who'd made sure she was taken care of even when they weren't speaking? "How long do I have to wait?" she asked. 6 months minimum. We need your father to stabilize or pass. Then ensure the inheritance transfers before the divorce finalizes. The timing has to be perfect. So I have to stay Grace Morrison for 6 more months while Brett parades his new girlfriend around. Yes. And you cannot access any visible Holland Capital money during that time. One luxury purchase, one slip, and Brett's lawyers will find it. You have to stay convincingly broke. Grace almost laughed. The billionaire who has to live like she's poor. The billionaire who's smart enough to wait. Margaret corrected. Grace stood and walked to the window. The city was waking up. Delivery trucks rumbled past. Early morning joggers braved the cold. Life continued, indifferent to personal catastrophes. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She opened it to find a photo. Brett and Sienna wrapped in blankets on the couch. Her couch, with her throw pillows, in her living room. The caption read, "First Christmas in our new home. So blessed. #couple goals." The pain in Grace's abdomen started as a cramp. Then it intensified. Then it became a wave that stole her breath. "Grace," Margaret stood quickly. "Grace, what's wrong?" "The baby," she gasped. Something's wrong with the baby. The emergency room blurred into chaos of lights and voices. Premature labor. 33 weeks. Too early. Too fast. They rushed her into surgery. Emergency cesarean section. Grace remembered thinking absurdly that Brett should be here, that she shouldn't have to do this alone. Then she remembered that Brett had chosen to make her do this alone. The anesthesia pulled her under. When she woke, the world had changed. "You have a son," the doctor said. 3 pounds, 12 ounces. He's in the NICU, but he's fighting. You can see him soon. Grace lay in the recovery room, body aching, heart shattered. Through the glass, she could see her tiny son. So small, impossibly small, covered in tubes and monitors, but alive, fighting. A nurse brought her phone. 57 messages, none from Brett, but 3 from Sienna's public Instagram account, tagged with photos from Christmas morning. Brett and Sienna opening presents, toasting with champagne, celebrating new beginnings. The caption read, "Sometimes the trash takes itself out. Hashtag living my best life." Grace blocked the account. Then she opened her email and found the divorce papers Brett's lawyer had sent. Attached was a note, "Sign these promptly. Every day you delay costs my client money and peace of mind." She could sign them right now. Be done with this nightmare. Or she could wait. Mrs. Morrison. Margaret stood in the doorway, still in her coat. "Your father woke up this morning. He's stable, and he wants to see you." Grace looked at her son through the glass. The baby Brett didn't even know had been born. The baby she'd carried alone through humiliation and heartbreak. "Tell Brett's lawyer I need more time," she said. "Tell them I'm recovering from emergency surgery. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. But I'm not signing anything for 6 months." Margaret smiled grimly. "Understood. Can I ask what you're going to do during those 6 months?" Grace's expression hardened. "I'm going to let Brett bury himself." The extended stay America in Bellevue smelled like industrial cleaner and other people's microwave dinners. Grace sat on the edge of the double bed, pumping breast milk with a machine that whirred and clicked in the silence. Through the thin wall, she could hear a television playing game shows and someone's bass-heavy music. Her son James slept in the portable crib beside her. Home from the NICU for 3 days now. Still so small, still needing special formula and monitoring equipment that beeped if his breathing became irregular. Her phone buzzed. Another Instagram notification. She'd stopped blocking Sienna's account because knowing what they were doing felt somehow necessary, like pressing on a bruise to make sure it still hurt. This time it was a TikTok video. Sienna giving a house tour. "So welcome to my new place," Sienna chirped, panning the camera across Grace's former living room. Except it wasn't Grace's living room anymore. The walls had been painted stark white. Grace's bookshelves were gone, replaced with ring lights and a backdrop wall covered in fake flowers. "We completely gutted the previous owner's boring teacher aesthetic," Sienna continued. "David's ex had like zero sense of style. Everything was beige and cluttered. Now it's my content creator studio." The camera focused on Sienna's face, perfectly made up, expression dripping with false sympathy. "And honestly, I think I did her a favor. She clearly didn't appreciate this space. Now someone who understands aesthetics can make it shine." The video had 2.1 million views. The comments were worse than the video itself. "She upgraded hard. The first wife was giving library vibes. This is an influencer palace. This is what happens when you don't prioritize your appearance." He traded a Honda for a Ferrari. Grace closed the app and set the phone face down. James stirred in his crib, making the little mewing sounds that meant he'd be hungry soon. She finished pumping, stored the milk in the mini fridge, and lifted her son carefully. He was so light, so fragile, so completely dependent on her. "It's okay," she whispered, settling him against her shoulder. "We're going to be okay." But she wasn't sure she believed it. By the end of January, Grace had established her new routine. Mornings, she taught 2 art classes at the community college. Afternoons, she worked at a Starbucks in Kirkland. Evenings, she took care of James, counted her dwindling savings, and watched Brett's life improve while hers fell apart. Her apartment was a study in careful poverty. Generic diapers, store-brand formula, furniture from Facebook Marketplace. She drove a 2009 Toyota Corolla that made concerning noises when she accelerated too quickly. Every purchase was calculated, every receipt saved. Margaret had been clear about the rules. Grace had to be demonstrably struggling. If Brett's lawyers ever investigated and found unexplained wealth, the entire plan collapsed. So Grace Holland, owner of $3.2 billion in assets, bought her groceries with WIC vouchers and clipped coupons like her life depended on it. Because it did. But late at night, after James fell asleep, Grace opened her encrypted laptop and became someone else entirely. She monitored her portfolio, made trades in Asian markets during Seattle's 3 a.m. hours, reviewed acquisition proposals, managed the empire no one knew she had. In January alone, she'd made $400 million in profit from volatility trading. Her net worth had grown to $3.6 billion. She was getting richer by the day while living like she was on food stamps. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Miss Bennett," a student stood into the doorway of Grace's community college classroom. "It's Morrison now," Grace said automatically. Though legally she was still Grace Morrison. She'd started using her mother's maiden name. Bennett, for work to create distance from Brett. I just wanted to say thank you for the extension on the project. The student continued. My mom's been sick and I've been helping take care of her. I really appreciate you understanding. Grace smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. Of course, family comes first. Take the time you need. After the student left, Grace sat alone in the empty classroom, surrounded by student artwork. Watercolors and charcoal sketches and clay sculptures in various states of completion. This had been her life before Brett. Teaching, creating, finding beauty in simple things. She'd been happy then. Her phone buzzed. Margaret calling. Grace, how are you holding up? I'm fine, Grace lied. Your father wants to see you. He's doing much better. Physical therapy is going well. Grace hadn't been back to Portland since James was born. Couldn't afford the flight. Couldn't take the time off work. Couldn't risk Brett's lawyers noticing she was traveling. Tell him I'll visit when I can, she said. He understands. Margaret paused. He also wanted me to tell you that he's proud of you. What you're doing. He knows it's not easy. Grace's throat tightened. It shouldn't be this hard. I shouldn't have to live it like this when there's money sitting in accounts with my name on them. 4 more months, Margaret said gently. You're halfway there. After she hung up, Grace allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. Then she washed her face, picked up James from the college daycare, and drove her rattling Corolla to her shift at Starbucks. Brett's promotion came through in February. Vice President of Marketing, $220,000 a year. The Seattle Business Journal ran a profile piece. Morrison credits his success to his partnership with lifestyle influencer Sienna Vale. The article read, together they've built a brand around modern luxury and authentic living. Authentic living. Grace read that phrase 3 times before she could move past it. The engagement announcement came next. Seattle Times lifestyle section, a professional photo of Brett and Sienna on a beach. Golden hour lighting, her hand extended to show off the ring. Morrison and Vale, a modern love story. The headline declared, the article gushed about their whirlwind romance, their shared values, their excitement about building a future together. No mention of Brett's pregnant wife, no mention of Christmas Eve, just a carefully crafted narrative about 2 beautiful people finding true love. Grace pinned the article to her refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. She looked at it every morning while making instant coffee in her cramped kitchen. Remember, she told herself, remember exactly who they are. In March, Sienna's Glow Up series went viral. A string of TikTok videos documenting the house transformation. Video 1 point of view. He finally chooses the woman who matches his ambition. Side-by-side photos. Grace in mom jeans and a cardigan. Sienna in designer athleisure. Video 2. When you realize he was just settling. A tour through the house, pointing out all of Grace's supposed mistakes. Too many books. Too many plants. Not enough clean lines. Video 3, before and after. From frumpy to fabulous. The bedroom makeover. Grace's cozy reading nook replaced with minimalist design. Her artwork taken down, replaced with motivational quotes in generic fonts. Each video had millions of views. Each comment section was a knife to Grace's heart. She did him a favor by leaving. The upgrade is insane. First wife was a placeholder. Second wife is the final boss. This is what happens when you let yourself go during marriage. Grace watched every video. Read every comment. Let the hatred fuel her resolve. She also documented everything. Screenshots saved in a folder labeled evidence. Not for court, for herself. So she'd never forget. So she'd never doubt that what she was doing was necessary. In April, Grace's breaking point came at a Walmart. 11 p.m. on a Thursday. She stood in the pharmacy aisle, James strapped to her chest in a worn baby carrier, staring at feminine hygiene products. The name brand postpartum pads she needed were $14.99. The generic brand was $9.47. She had exactly $12 in her checking account until her Starbucks paycheck cleared on Friday. 2 young women walked past, talking loudly about their weekend plans. Bottle service at that new club downtown. That designer bag one of them had been eyeing. Whether $300 was too much for a pair of shoes. Grace bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. Her phone rang. Margaret. She answered without greeting. I can't do this anymore. Sarah. Margaret started. Grace. It's Grace, and I'm standing in Walmart at midnight because it's the only time James sleeps through shopping. My C-section scar still hurts when I bend over. I'm trying to decide if I can afford the good postpartum pads or if I need to buy the cheap ones that leak. And my ex-husband just posted Instagram photos from a Michelin star restaurant in Bellevue. 2 more months. Margaret said, 2 more months of what humiliation, poverty. Watching him live my life with someone else, 2 more months until you never have to be this person again. Grace laughed bitterly. What if I just take the 5,000 and walk away? What if I sign the papers and let him win? You could, Margaret said, but then Brett wins and Sienna wins. And every woman who's ever been called not enough loses. I'm not doing this for other women. I'm doing this because I'm tired of being stepped on. Good. Anger is better than despair. Use it. Grace bought the generic pads. She drove home in her rattling Corolla. She fed James and put him to bed. She sat alone in her dim apartment, eating ramen and looking at the Seattle skyline through her window. Somewhere out there, Brett was sleeping in her bed, in her house, living her life. But not for much longer. David Sterling had never felt more successful. The promotion, the new salary, the beautiful girlfriend who understood his ambition. This was the life he'd always wanted, the life he deserved. Babe, come look at this, Sienna called from the living room. He found her on the couch, laptop open, scrolling through analytics for her TikTok account. The house tour video just hit 3 million views, she said, grinning. And I got 5 new brand deal inquiries today. FabFitFun wants to sponsor a video. Revolve is sending free clothes. HelloFresh is offering $2,000 for a kitchen integration. Brett kissed the top of her head. That's amazing. I told you this would work. We're a power couple, Sienna said, tilting her head back to look at him. You know that, right? Like, people are watching us. We're building something real here. She wasn't wrong. Brett's professional network had expanded exponentially since he started dating Sienna. Her 400,000 Instagram followers translated into visibility for him too. Clients who wanted to work with the company that employed the guy dating the lifestyle influencer. Speaking invitations. Podcast appearances. He was being seen. Finally, his phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. Grace's attorney filed for another extension on the divorce proceedings. Something about custody arrangements and financial discovery. Brett read it aloud. Sienna rolled her eyes. She's stalling, trying to squeeze more money out of you. There's no more money to squeeze. She's entitled to discovery. It's normal. How much longer? Maybe 3 more months. But honestly, let her suffer a little. She'll take whatever we offer eventually. She always does. Sienna smiled and returned to her laptop, already planning her next viral video. The wedding planning began in earnest in May. I'm thinking the Edgewater, Sienna said, flipping through venue brochures at their dining table. Waterfront views. Very Seattle. We could do golden hour photos on the pier. Brett looked at the pricing sheet and suppressed a wince. $75,000 for the venue alone. But Sienna had convinced him that the wedding would be content gold. Sponsored posts, brand partnerships. They'd make the money back, and then some. Whatever you want, he said. I also think we should upgrade the house, Sienna continued. The kitchen is fine, but it's not Instagram kitchen. I'm talking marble countertops, subway tile backsplash, brass fixtures, very modern farmhouse. How much are we talking? 50,000, maybe 60. But think about it. Babe, every sponsored post I do in a taste in that kitchen translates to brand deals. It's an investment. Brett did the math in his head. The wedding, the renovations, the lifestyle they were building. His salary was good, but it wouldn't cover everything. They'd need to take out a loan, use his savings, max out some credit cards. But it would be worth it. This was what the success looked like. You had to spend money to make money. Everyone knew that. Let's do it, he said. Sienna squealed and threw her arms around him. This is going to be amazing. We're going to have the most beautiful wedding, the most beautiful life. Brett believed her. Why wouldn't he? Everything was finally falling into place. Sienna's beauty line launched in late May with significant fanfare. Sinclair Skin, she announced in a glossy Instagram video. Premium skincare for the modern woman. Because you deserve to glow. She'd convinced Brett to invest $200,000 in the venture. His savings plus a business loan. But the projections were solid. Her audience was engaged. The pre-orders had been strong. The products arrived from the manufacturer 2 weeks later. Generic white bottles with gold lettering, moisturizer, serum, face masks, nothing revolutionary, but the branding was sleek. The first reviews came in within days. Broke me out immediately. Smells like chemicals. Cheap formulation. Not worth the price. Then the one-star reviews flooded in. Then the angry customers demanding refunds. Then the think pieces about influencer scams and predatory marketing. Sienna's comment sections turned vicious. Scammer. You burned us. Never trusting an influencer again. Her follower count started dropping. 390,000. 370,000. 350,000. Brand deals pulled out. Sponsorships evaporated. The money they'd spent on inventory sat in their garage in boxes, unsellable. Brett came home one evening to find Sienna crying on the couch. It's ruined, she sobbed. My whole brand, my reputation, everything. We'll fix it, Brett said, but his voice lacked conviction. They just lost $200,000. The loan payments would start coming due. The wedding deposits were non-refundable. The kitchen renovation was half finished, and his company had just announced layoffs. I'm sorry, Brett, but we're restructuring. Your position is being eliminated. Brett sat in his boss's office. The words not quite making sense. Eliminated. But I just got promoted. The promotion was before the third quarter numbers came in. We're cutting costs across the board. You'll receive 3 months severance. I'll write you a strong recommendation letter. 3 months severance. He'd budgeted for a $220,000 salary. Now he'd be making nothing. With a $75,000 wedding venue bill coming due, with loan payments on a failed beauty line, with renovation costs he couldn't stop now. He called Sienna from the parking lot. They laid me off. Silence. Then what budget cuts? I'm out effective immediately. But the wedding, the house, the money we owe. I know. Brett's voice cracked. We're screwed. We're completely screwed. That night they had their first real fight. How did you not see this coming? Sienna shouted. You said it would make millions. You had the business plan. I had projections. You're supposed to be the business expert. I believed in you. Well, maybe you should have believed in a prenup, like I suggested. The words hung between them like broken glass. A prenup, Brett said slowly. Are you saying you want out? Sienna's expression shifted, calculating. I'm saying we're not in the position I thought we'd be in when I agreed to marry you. Meaning I need to think about my future, my brand, my career. And right now, being attached to you isn't helping any of those things. She went to bed in the guest room. Brett stayed up scrolling through his phone, looking at job postings he wasn't qualified for, calculating debts he couldn't pay. His lawyer called the next morning. Good news. Grace agreed to finalize the divorce. Papers should be processed by end of week. You're almost free. Brett felt nothing resembling relief, just a hollow certainty that everything he'd built was collapsing around him. Great, he said. That's great. But it wasn't great. Nothing was great. He just didn't know yet how much worse it was about to get. Grace marked June 1st on her calendar with a red pen. 1 month left. 30 days until the trust from her father's estate transferred. 30 days until she could stop pretending to be broke. 30 days until Brett discovered exactly what he'd thrown away. Your father wants you to know that the final paperwork is being prepared, Margaret said during their weekly call. Everything's moved through probate faster than expected. Patricia's legal challenge was dismissed with prejudice. The judge called her claim frivolous and opportunistic. Grace smiled despite herself. Patricia, her father's second wife from his brief remarriage 15 years ago, had tried to contest the will on grounds of diminished capacity. She'd argued that Thomas had been unduly influenced by Grace after his heart attack. The judge hadn't been sympathetic. Once the divorce finalizes, Margaret continued, we'll need to schedule the public announcement. Your father wants to do a formal press conference, announce his retirement, introduce you as the new CEO of Holland Lumber and Holland Capital combined. How big of a news story will it be? Front page of Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, Forbes. We're talking about one of the largest private transfers of wealth in recent history, and the daughter nobody knew existed taking over a multi-billion-dollar empire. That's a story that writes itself. Grace looked around her tiny apartment. Generic furniture from IKEA, mismatched dishes, a leak in the bathroom ceiling that her landlord kept promising to fix. James slept in his crib, peaceful and unaware that his entire world was about to transform. I want the divorce finalized before any announcement, Grace said. Not the same day, not the same week. I want it done, filed, official, and irreversible before Brett even knows what's happening. Smart. I'll coordinate with the court. We can push for expedited processing. How long if everything goes smoothly? Divorce finalized by June 15th. Trust transfer complete by June 20th. Press conference June 22nd. 1 week between divorce and revelation. 1 week for Brett to think he'd won before discovering he'd lost everything. Grace allowed herself a moment of dark satisfaction. Let's do it. The divorce papers came through on June 14th. Official, stamped, final. Grace Bennett Morrison was no longer married to Brett Morrison. She sat at her kitchen table holding the document, feeling nothing but cold certainty. 8 years of marriage dissolved in legal language and notary stamps. Her phone rang. Brett's number. She answered without speaking. It's done, Brett said. His voice was flat, exhausted. We're officially divorced. I know, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. About how it ended. About Christmas Eve. I was cruel. I shouldn't have done it like that. Grace waited. Sienna and I aren't working out, Brett continued. The business stuff got complicated. The wedding's probably off. Everything's kind of falling apart. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, well, he laughed bitterly. I guess karma's real, right? I left my pregnant wife for an Instagram model, and now I'm unemployed and broke. The universe has a sense of humor. It does, Grace agreed quietly. For what it's worth, I hope you're doing okay. You and the baby. I saw in the court documents that you had a boy, James. We're fine. Good. That's good. Brett paused. Okay, I guess this is it. Goodbye, Grace. Goodbye, Brett. She hung up and immediately called her lawyer. File the name change paperwork. Effective immediately. Grace Bennett Morrison is now legally Grace Holland. Done. Anything else? Yes. Schedule the press conference for June 22nd, 9 a.m. Holland Capital Corporate Office. Invite every major financial publication. This needs to be impossible to miss. Understood. Margaret paused. Grace, congratulations. You made it. Grace looked at her son sleeping peacefully, at the calendar marked with red ink, at the life she'd built from scraps while sitting on a fortune. Not yet, she said. But soon, June 22nd dawned clear and bright. Grace woke at 5 a.m., fed James, and left him with the professional nanny she'd secretly hired 2 days earlier. The nanny had been thoroughly vetted, background checked, NDA signed. Everything from here would be public record. Grace drove to her penthouse office in a car service. Also arranged quietly through Margaret. She'd kept her Toyota Corolla to maintain appearances until the last possible moment. But today required a different kind of presence. The Holland Capitol building stood 60 stories tall in downtown Seattle. Grace had avoided coming here in person for 6 months. Now she walked through the lobby like she owned it. Because she did. Her father waited in the executive suite. Thomas Holland, 68 years old, standing with a cane but steady on his feet. Months of physical therapy had returned his strength. Grace, he said softly. Dad. They'd had this conversation already. The apologies, the explanations, the careful rebuilding of trust between two stubborn people who'd both been wrong. But seeing him here, in this context, made it real. Are you ready? He asked. Yes. Patricia sent a message. Said she hopes you fail spectacularly. Grace smiled coldly. Patricia can watch me succeed spectacularly instead. The press conference room filled quickly. Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, CNBC, local news, financial bloggers. Everyone who mattered in the world of commercial real estate and high finance. Margaret approached with a final briefing. Standard questions about your background, your plans for the company, your relationship with your father. We've prepared responses. Stay on message. Professional, confident. Don't engage with anything personal. Understood. At 9 a.m. precisely. Grace walked to the podium. Cameras flashed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She wore a navy suit. Simple jewelry. Her hair professionally styled. She looked every inch the executive she was about to become. Good morning, she said. Her voice was steady, clear. I'm Grace Holland. As of today, I am the CEO of Holland Capital and Holland Lumber Industries. The announcement dominated every financial news outlet within an hour. Seattle lumber mogul Thomas Holland announces retirement. Holland Holdings CEO, transition daughter Grace Holland, takes helm. Meet Grace Holland, the $3.6 billion heiress who's been hiding in plain sight. Bloomberg ran a profile with photos from the press conference. Grace at the podium, confident and commanding. Grace shaking hands with board members. Grace standing beside her father. The passing of an empire captured in a single frame. Forbes published an analysis of the trust transfer. The timeline, the assets, the staggering scope of wealth changing hands. Every major outlet picked up the story. Some mentioned Grace's past, her mother's death, her estrangement from her father, her quiet life in Seattle. None of them mentioned Brett yet. Brett Morrison was eating cereal when his phone exploded. The first text came from Marcus, his college roommate. Dude, is this your ex-wife? Then Kevin from his old company. Broke dear, did you know? Then his brother, his mother, 3 former coworkers, and a guy he'd played soccer with in high school. Your ex is a billionaire. Brett opened Bloomberg on his phone. The top story loaded slowly, probably because his internet was getting throttled for late payment. Then he saw the photo. Grace? His Grace. Except not his anymore, and apparently never really his to begin with. She stood at a podium wearing a suit he'd never seen, looking confident in a way she'd never looked when they were married. The headline read, Grace Holland assumes control of $3.6 billion empire. His coffee mug slipped from his hand. It shattered on the floor, coffee spreading across the tile like spilled blood. What he said, the word out loud to no one. What Sienna appeared from the bedroom, yoga mat in hand. What's wrong? Brett couldn't speak. He handed her the phone. Sienna's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, horror, then calculation. That's Grace, she said slowly. I know. Your ex-wife Grace. I know. Grace Holland. Your ex-wife is Grace Holland. The Whitmore. The real estate Whitmore. Brett grabbed his laptop and started Googling frantically. Grace Holland, Seattle. Grace Bennett Holland. He cross-referenced old wedding photos with the Bloomberg images. It was her. When did your divorce finalize? Sienna asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Brett pulled up the paperwork. June 14th, 8 days ago. Sienna was already reading the Forbes article. Miss Holland assumed control of the family trust following a 6-month transition period that concluded this week. She read aloud. The trust transferred on June 20th. The math assembled itself in Brett's brain like a car crash in slow motion. I was married to her during the trust transfer. He said, yes. Community property law, California, Washington. But yes, if I'd still been married when she inherited, Sienna's voice was mechanical, you'd be entitled to half of $3.6 billion. That's 1.8 billion. With a B, Brett's legs gave out. He sat on the floor surrounded by broken ceramic and spilled coffee. But I rushed the divorce. He said, I pushed for it to finalize quickly. Because you thought she was a broke art teacher trying to take your money. The full scope of his mistake crashed over him like a tsunami. Oh my God, he whispered. Oh my God, I divorced a billionaire. For you. Sienna's expression went ice cold. Excuse me if I'd waited. If I just waited one more week. You didn't know to wait. David, you didn't know because you never asked. You never saw her. This is insane. This is insane. Brett was on his feet, pacing. I need to call my lawyer. I can contest this. Fraud. She committed fraud by hiding her identity. Sienna laughed without humor. Yeah, I'm sure judges will love the argument that you would have stayed married if you'd known she was rich. That'll make you look great. Brett sank back down. The reality was settling in like concrete. He'd been married to Grace Holland, actual billionaire Grace Holland, and he'd left her on Christmas Eve while she was pregnant. For an Instagram influencer with a failed beauty line, he'd thrown away more than $1.8 billion because he hadn't bothered to know his own wife. I need to fix this, he said. I need to call her, apologize, explain that if I'd known. If you'd known, you would have what Sienna's voice dripped with contempt. Stayed with her. You want to call her and say, sorry, I left you. But if I'd known you were rich, I would have stuck around. Do you hear yourself? Brett's phone kept buzzing. Text after text, call after call. He opened Twitter and found his name trending. Man fumbles 1.88 billion on the 1-yard line. Point of view, you divorce your wife and she becomes a billionaire the next day. Brett Morrison's billion-dollar mistake. A thread. The internet was having a field day. His LinkedIn was flooded with messages. Some mocking, some asking for interviews. One from a documentary filmmaker wanting to tell his story. His email was equally chaotic. Reporters requesting comment. Old acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly interested in reconnecting. And through it all, Grace's face on Bloomberg. Confident, successful, powerful. Everything he thought he wanted. Everything he'd been chasing with Sienna and the lifestyle brand and the Instagram presence. She'd had it the whole time. She'd been sitting on an empire while he treated her like garbage. Sienna was already packing. "What are you doing?" Brett asked. "What does it look like? I'm leaving." "You're leaving now, David. I attached myself to you because I thought you were successful, stable, going places. You're none of those things. You're unemployed, in debt, and you just became the most mocked man on the internet. My brand can't survive being associated with this disaster. Your brand, your brand. I invested everything in your brand. I lost my job because of your brand, and I lost my reputation because of your decisions. We're done, boys." She pulled her suitcase from the closet, the same suitcase she'd rolled into this house 18 months ago. Within 2 hours, Sienna was gone. Brett sat alone in the house that used to be Grace's, surrounded by empty rooms and broken dreams, and understood with perfect clarity that he'd destroyed his life for absolutely nothing. The meme started within hours. A TikTok user created a video showing Brett and Sienna's Instagram posts side by side with Grace's Bloomberg coverage. 3 million views in 24 hours. Explaining how Brett Morrison fumbled the bag of the century became a 12-part series from a financial advisor with 2 million followers. Lawyers weighed in with analysis of community property law. If he'd waited 48 more hours, one popular legal commentary account explained, he'd be entitled to half. This is a $1.8 billion mistake. YouTube think pieces multiplied. The psychology of status, chasing a cautionary tale. How one man's greed cost him everything. Grace Holland, the ultimate revenge story. The hashtag Brett Morrison trended for 3 consecutive days. Twitter users were merciless. Imagine explaining to your future kids that you had $1.8 billion and traded it for Instagram likes. This man left a pregnant billionaire on Christmas Eve. The universe has a sense of humor, and her name is Grace Holland. Brett's face became a meme. Screenshots from his old LinkedIn. Photos Amber had posted of them together, always with captions highlighting his catastrophic mistake. Reporters camped outside his apartment building. He couldn't leave without cameras in his face. "Mr. Morrison, do you regret your decision? Brett, did you know your wife was wealthy? Any comment on the divorce timing?" He stopped answering, stopped going outside, ordered groceries for delivery, watched his life become a cautionary tale in real time. Meanwhile, Grace's star rose. Forbes ran a cover story, "The Heiress Who Chose Herself." Wall Street Journal published a profile, Grace Holland's strategic patience. Good Morning America invited her for an interview. She declined, but the segment ran anyway. Billion-dollar divorce mistake, how one woman's silence became her power. Women's business conferences requested her as a speaker. TED wanted her for a talk. Harvard Business School asked her to guest lecture. The narrative crystallized quickly. Woman told she wasn't enough reveals. She never needed validation. Grace handled it all with professional grace. She gave no interviews about Brett, made no public comments about her marriage, simply focused on her work at Holland Capital, which made the contrast even more devastating. Brett, unemployed and mocked. Grace, celebrated and powerful. Brett desperately trying to explain himself to anyone who would listen. Grace declining all personal interviews and letting her success speak for itself. The optics couldn't have been worse for Brett. Sienna, characteristically, pivoted fast. She posted an emotional YouTube video 3 days after the news broke. My truth about Brett Morrison. Sitting on a couch, minimal makeup, looking vulnerable and honest. She told her story. I was manipulated too. She began. He told me his ex was toxic, controlling, holding him back from his potential. I believed him because I had no reason not to. I thought I was helping someone escape an unhealthy marriage. She wiped away tears. I had no idea who Grace really was. He clearly didn't either. And now people are calling me a homewrecker and a gold digger. But I'm a victim here too. I trusted a man who didn't even know his own wife. How could I have known what he didn't know? The comment section filled with support. She's right, he played both of them. Sienna deserves better too. The real villain is the man who couldn't see value in either woman. Within a week, Sienna's follower count was back up, 600,000, growing daily. She launched a podcast called Red Flags and Receipts about toxic relationships and learning to spot manipulative men. The first episode, when he leaves his pregnant wife on Christmas, she never said Brett's name. Didn't need to. Everyone knew. The podcast hit number 3 on Apple's charts. Sienna not only survived the scandal, she thrived on it. Turned herself from villain to victim to survivor. Monetized the entire experience. She sent Grace's assistant a direct message. No hard feelings. He played us both. Hope the empire treats you well. Grace saw it, considered responding, decided against it. Sienna was smart, adaptable. She'd land on her feet. Brett wouldn't. Brett's desperate media tour began in late June. He accepted an interview with a morning talk show desperate for ratings. Brett, thank you for coming on, the host said. I think everyone's wondering. Did you know? Of course I didn't know. Brett's voice was defensive, angry. She lied to me. She used a fake name. She used her mother's maiden name. That's not illegal. It's deceptive. She knew exactly what she was doing. But sir, the host interrupted smoothly, you left her. You filed for divorce. You chose to end the marriage. Because I didn't know she was. The host interrupted again. Rich, so you're saying if you'd known she had money, you would have stayed? Brett's face went red. No, that's not, because that's what this sounds like. You're upset you left someone who turned out to be wealthy. The studio audience murmured. Not sympathetic sounds. She manipulated me. Brett insisted. The timing is too convenient. The trust transfer timeline is public record. It was 6 months due to probate law. Not her choice. Brett stood up, ripped off his microphone. This is ridiculous. He walked off set. The clip went mega viral. Man walks off set when called out played on loop across social media. His final attempt was a podcast interview with a host who'd pivoted to covering social scandals. Do you feel you deserve any of her inheritance? The host asked. I supported her for 8 years. Brett said, she worked? She paid half the bills. According to court documents, I gave her a life. A life in a townhouse she could have bought with pocket change if she'd wanted to. She should have told me. Why would it have changed how you treated her? Long pause. Too long. Yes, I would have respected her more. The host just stared at him. Brett realized what he'd said. Wait, that came out wrong, too late. He would have respected her where if he knew she had money trended for 48 hours. Think pieces appeared everywhere. Brett Morrison and the problem with status-based respect. Why men like Brett Morrison think wealth equals worth. The quiet cruelty of conditional love. Brett's former company issued a statement. Mr. Morrison resigned to pursue other opportunities. We wish him well in his future endeavors. He was unemployable, toxic, a walking cautionary tale. His lawyer stopped returning calls. His brother called to say their mother was embarrassed. Old friends unfollowed him on social media. He sat in his empty apartment. The furniture gone because Sienna had bought most of it and taken it when she left. Eating takeout on the floor. Watching news coverage of Grace's glamorous press appearances. He'd lost everything. And the worst part was knowing it was entirely his own fault. 6 weeks after the announcement, Grace received a message from building security. Miss Holland, there's a Brett Morrison in the lobby. He's requesting to see you. No appointment. Grace sat in her corner office, 60 stories above Seattle, and considered her options. She could have security remove him, could ignore him completely, could maintain the professional distance she'd carefully cultivated. Or she could face him one final time. Let him see exactly what he'd lost. Let him up, she said. Her assistant looked surprised. Are you sure? Yes. I need to do this. Brett looked terrible. He'd lost weight. His suit was rumpled, like he'd been wearing it for days. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His normally carefully styled hair was messy. He stopped in the doorway of her office, taking in the massive space. floor-to-ceiling windows, original artwork. The view of the city spread out below like a kingdom. "Nice place," he said. His voice was rough. "David." Grace remained seated behind her desk. "Professional? Cool. What can I do for you? You could start by explaining why you lied to me for 8 years." "I didn't lie. You never asked." "I asked about your family. You said your father was in real estate." "He is." "You didn't say he was Thomas Holland. You used a fake name." Grace stood, her patience already fraying. "Bennett was my mother's maiden name. I legally changed it after she died because I wanted distance from my father. I met you as Grace Bennett. That wasn't deception. That was self-preservation. You let me think you were nobody." Grace's voice rose. "I was nobody to you, Brett. That's the point. When you thought I was just a teacher, I wasn't worth respecting. I wasn't worth staying faithful to. I wasn't worth keeping. That's not fair. You left me 7 months pregnant on Christmas Eve." Grace was shouting now. Months of controlled fury finally breaking free. "You brought your girlfriend to my house and told me to pack my things. You filmed it. You humiliated me online. And you did all of that when you thought I had nothing. So tell me, Brett, what would have been different if you'd known silence filled the office?" Brett's shoulders sagged. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I would have stayed." "Exactly." Grace's voice was cold. "You would have stayed for the money. Not for me, not for our baby, for the lifestyle, for the status." So this was all revenge. Grace shook her head, suddenly tired. "No, this was survival. You think I wanted to spend 6 months living in poverty while sitting on billions? You think I enjoyed watching you parade Sienna around while I was pumping breast milk in a one-bedroom apartment? You could have told me Brett, when you handed me divorce papers, when you called me worthless, when Sienna posted videos mocking my clothes, my hair, my home." Brett ran a hand through his hair. "I made a mistake. People make mistakes." "Yes, and consequences are what teach us not to make them again. So you're just ruining my life." Grace walked to the window, looking out at the city. "I'm not ruining your life, Brett. I'm just not saving it. There's a difference. You were right, though." She turned back to face him. "About what? You want to know the really sad part? I would have given you money if you'd left me with kindness. If you'd said, 'Grace, I'm unhappy. I want a divorce. Let's do this respectfully.' I would have helped you, set you up, made sure you were okay. But I didn't know." "Exactly." Grace's voice cracked. "You didn't know I had money, so you treated me like garbage. You showed me your true character, and now you're furious that your cruelty cost you a fortune." Brett sat down heavily in one of her office chairs, put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I was terrible. I was wrong I treated you horribly. I see that now. Do you see it, or do you just see the price tag? Both." He looked up, and there were actual tears in his eyes. "I see both, away, and I hate myself for it." The honesty surprised her. Grace's anger cooled slightly. "Brett, you're not a monster. You're just a man who was so obsessed with looking successful that you couldn't see what you actually had. I wasn't exciting enough. I wasn't Instagram perfect. I was just me. And that wasn't enough for you." "It should have been," Brett said quietly. "Yes, it should have been." Long silence. Outside, the city hummed with life. Inside, two people who'd once loved each other sat with the wreckage of what they'd become. "Can I ask you something?" Brett said finally. "What? Why did you wait? Why didn't you just tell me immediately and watch me squirm? Why spend 6 months suffering?" Grace returned to her desk, sat down, folded her hands carefully. "Because if I'd revealed everything immediately, you would have fought me in court, claimed you deserved half because I hid assets. It would have been years of litigation. This way, the money was legally mine before the divorce finalized. Clean, uncontestable." Brett let out a bitter laugh. "So you played me?" "No, I just didn't interrupt while you played yourself." He stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. About Christmas, about Sienna, about all of it. I know you are. Does that change anything? No. Sorry doesn't undo what you did. It just means you finally understand what you lost." Brett nodded, turned to leave. "He's beautiful." By the way, he said softly, our son, I saw pictures online. Grace's expression softened slightly. Yes, he is. Would you ever let me meet him? Grace considered this. The man who'd abandoned them. The father who hadn't been there. The human being who was genuinely trying to do better. When you're ready to be a father, not when you're ready to perform being one. Call my lawyer. We'll arrange supervised visits. But Brett, her voice turned cold. If you hurt him the way you hurt me, I will make what happened to you look like mercy. I understand. He left. Grace sat alone in her office. No triumphant music, no satisfaction, just exhaustion. She'd won, but winning felt a lot like losing, just with better furniture. 3 months later, the dust had settled into new patterns. Brett Morrison worked at a mid-level marketing firm in Tacoma. The salary was $85,000, less than half what he'd made before. The apartment was a studio in a less desirable neighborhood. The car was a 10-year-old Honda. He attended court-ordered co-parenting classes every Tuesday evening. They taught him about communication and boundaries and putting the child's needs first. Things he should have known already, but hadn't bothered to learn. Supervised visits with James happened twice a month, 1 hour each time. A social worker sat in the corner taking notes while Brett played with blocks and tried to connect with a toddler who didn't know him. It was humbling, humiliating, even. It was also necessary. His therapist, also court-mandated, helped him understand the narcissism that had driven his choices, the insecurity masked by ambition, the way he'd measured his worth by external validation. You didn't leave Grace because she wasn't enough. The therapist said during one session, you left because you didn't think you were enough. And instead of doing the work to feel worthy, you found someone who made you feel important. Brett was learning, slowly, painfully, but learning. He deleted all social media, stopped reading articles about himself, focused on being present for the small life he was rebuilding. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, but it was real, and maybe that mattered more. Sienna Vale's podcast had 2 million downloads and climbing. She'd pivoted from lifestyle influencer to relationship expert, chronicling her journey from toxic situationship survivor to empowered single woman. Her book, Upgrade How I Survived the Morrison Scandal, hit the New York Times bestseller list. She was dating a venture capitalist now. No social media posts about him. She'd learned that lesson. But people who followed her closely noted the designer bags, the expensive restaurants, the subtle flex of a life upgraded once again. She occasionally referenced my ex's ex-wife in interviews, always with respect. Grace Holland is goals, she said on a women's empowerment panel. She knew her worth even when no one else did. That's the energy we should all aspire to. It was savvy, self-aware, good for her brand. Sienna had turned controversy into currency. She was fine, she'd always be fine. Grace Holland's life transformed in ways both public and private. Holland Capital thrived under her leadership. She implemented new policies around affordable housing development, converted luxury units into family housing, established scholarship programs for single mothers pursuing business degrees. The press loved it. Billionaire with a heart, Grace Holland capitalism with compassion. But the changes weren't for press. They were personal. She knew what it felt like to be pregnant and scared and broke, knew the desperation of choosing between diapers and dinner, knew the weight of doing it alone. If her wealth could ease that burden for other women, then maybe the suffering had meant something. In August, she bought Brett's foreclosed townhouse at auction, the house where he'd humiliated her, where Sienna had filmed her mockery. Grace demolished it. In its place, she built the Evelyn Bennett Memorial Housing Complex, 24 units of affordable family housing. Named after her mother, the grand opening was covered by every Seattle news outlet. Where Billionaire was humiliated, she now provides hope. Read one headline, Grace stood at the ribbon cutting, visibly pregnant with her second child, and spoke about second chances and choosing compassion over cruelty. The address where Brett had destroyed her life was now a place where struggling families could build theirs. It felt like poetry, like justice, like healing. She gave birth to her daughter in February. 8 pounds, 3 ounces, healthy and loud and perfect. This time she wasn't alone. Her father was there. Margaret, the nanny who'd become like family, a circle of support she'd built carefully. David sent flowers to the hospital, white roses with a card that read, Congratulations. She's lucky to have you. Grace kept the card, not out of sentiment, just as a reminder of how far they'd both come. The supervised visits continued. Brett was consistent, which surprised her. Every other Sunday without fail. He showed up, sober, prepared, genuinely trying. James was starting to recognize him, called him Dada now, ran to him with chubby toddler legs during visits. It wasn't the family Grace had imagined, but it was a family of sorts, broken and rebuilt, different but functional. "How's he doing?" Grace asked the social worker after one visit. "Better. He's engaged. Present. Follows all the guidelines. I think we could potentially move to unsupervised visits in 6 months if this continues." Grace nodded. "Keep the supervision for now. But thank you for the update." She wanted Brett to be a good father. Not for Brett, for James. Every child deserved a parent who showed up. On a Tuesday evening in September, Grace sat in her Tribeca penthouse, her daughter asleep in her arms, watching James play with blocks on the floor. Her father called. The board voted. He said, "They want to rename the foundation after you, the Grace Holland Foundation for Women and Families." "No," Grace said immediately. "Keep it as Holland Holdings. This isn't about me. It absolutely is about you. It's about the work. The work is what matters." Her father chuckled. "You sound like your mother." "Good." After they hung up, Grace looked around her home, not ostentatious, comfortable, filled with baby toys and books and warmth. She'd won. In every measurable way, she'd won. But she'd also learned that winning isn't the same as healing, that revenge isn't the same as peace, that getting everything you wanted doesn't fill the holes left by what you lost. She was wealthy, powerful, successful. She was also scarred, careful, still learning to trust. The money hadn't fixed her. The victory hadn't healed her. But time might, and love, and the work of building something meaningful from the ruins of what she'd survived. That was enough for now. It was enough. The Plaza Hotel glittered like a constellation had fallen to earth. Grace Holland stood backstage at the Holland Foundation's annual gala, one hand on her pregnant belly, the other smoothing her dress. 18 months since that first press conference. 18 months of building and healing and learning to be the woman she'd always had the potential to become. 5 minutes. "Miss Holland," a production assistant said. Grace nodded, took a breath, prepared herself. The ballroom was filled with Manhattan's elite, philanthropists, business leaders, politicians, the same people who'd once looked through her when she was just Grace Bennett, art teacher. Now they paid $50,000 a plate to hear her speak. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her father sat in the front row, recovered and proud. Her children were with the nanny in a private room nearby. James, almost 3 years old now. Her daughter Emma, 8 months, and somewhere in the back, because Margaret had invited him in what Grace suspected was a test of her own growth, was Brett Morrison. Grace had known he'd be here, had prepared for this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Grace Holland." She walked to the podium. The applause was immediate, genuine. She waited for it to fade. 1 year ago, she began, her voice clear and strong. "I stood in a hospital room, alone on Christmas, holding my premature son. I had just been divorced, humiliated online, called worthless by a man who'd promised to love me forever. The room was silent. Listening, in that moment, I had two choices. Reveal who I really was and destroy him immediately, or wait and see if the universe has a sense of poetic justice." A few knowing laughs rippled through the crowd. I chose patience. Not because I wanted revenge, though I won't lie and say it didn't feel good, but because I needed to know something. I needed to know if he would treat me differently if he knew, if my value would suddenly increase because of my bank account. Grace paused. Let the weight of that sink in. The answer was yes, and that taught me everything. She looked directly at the camera streaming the event live. My mother, Evelyn Bennett, used to say money doesn't make you powerful. Knowing yourself does. I spent 10 years hiding from wealth because I was afraid it would change me. Then I spent 6 months hiding my wealth because someone else had already changed me, made me feel small, worthless, invisible. Her voice strengthened. But here's what I learned. Power isn't about money. It's about choice. I chose to walk away from billions at 21. I chose to walk back at 36. Both times. It was my choice. Nobody took that from me. She looked around the room, at faces she recognized, at people who doubted her, underestimated her, ignored her. So to every woman who's been told she's not enough, you are, with or without the money, the status, the Instagram followers, the ring, you are enough. And when you know that, truly know it, that's when you're truly wealthy. The standing ovation was immediate, thunderous. Grace stepped down from the podium, cradling her pregnant belly, and let herself feel the moment. She'd survived, more than survived. She'd transformed her pain into purpose. After the gala, Grace stepped outside for air. Snow was falling softly on Fifth Avenue. String lights turned the city into something magical, the kind of night that belonged in movies. That was a beautiful speech. She turned. Brett stood a few feet away, hesitant. "Thank you," Grace said. "I saw Jamie today. During the visit, he said Dada and then tried to teach me how to stack blocks." Grace smiled slightly. "He's very particular about his block stacking technique. I noticed." Brett moved closer. "Thank you for letting me be part of his life. I know I don't deserve it. You're his father. He deserves to know you. The real you, not the man you pretended to be." Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just present. "Boy or girl?" Brett asked, gesturing to her belly. "Girl. Due in February." "That's wonderful. Congratulations." "Really, thank you." Brett shoved his hands in his pockets. He looked different, older, humbler, more real. "I saw the housing project. Bennett Memorial. That was our house." "Yes. You tore it down. I built something better." Brett nodded slowly. "Accepting this, I've been going to therapy, court mandated, but it's helping. I'm learning about narcissism, insecurity, all the things I was too proud to admit. That's good. That's important. My therapist asked me something last week. She said, if you could go back to Christmas Eve knowing everything you know now, what would you do differently?" Grace waited. "I said I'd choose you. But she pointed out that I'd only choose you because I know now, not because I loved you then." The honesty surprised Grace. Brett had never been good at honesty, and she prompted, "And she's right. I didn't love you the way you deserved. I love the idea of success more than I love my wife. That's something I have to live with." Grace looked at him, really looked at him, not with hate, not with love, just with clarity about who he was and what he'd done. "Brett, I don't hate you anymore. I also don't forgive you. What you did was cruel. The consequences, me getting my inheritance right after our divorce, that was timing. But the pain you caused, that was your choice. I know. I hope you find someone who sees you the way you couldn't see me. I genuinely mean that. I hope you learn to love someone for who they are, not what they represent." "What about you? Are you seeing anyone?" Grace smiled. "That's none of your business." "Fair." Brett paused. "Can I ask you one last thing? What if I'd stayed? If I'd been faithful? If we were still married when your father got sick? Would you have told me?" Grace thought about it. Really thought about it. "Yes," she said finally. "Because the man I married, the one I thought I married, would have deserved to know. But you weren't that man anymore. Maybe you never were." Brett nodded. Accepted it. "I should go. Congratulations again on everything." He walked away into the snowy Manhattan night, alone, but walking with more purpose than before. Grace watched him leave, then turned back to the gala, the warmth, the light, her life. Inside, her father was holding James, who'd been brought down from the private room. "Mama," James shouted, reaching for her. Grace took her son, held him close, felt the baby in her belly kick. "Your mother would be proud," her father said quietly. "I hope so." She looked around the ballroom, the empire she now controlled, the life she'd rebuilt from nothing. Everyone survived. Nobody's perfect. Life went on, and sometimes, if you were patient enough, the universe had a sense of poetic justice after all. 2 years later, Grace Holland sat in her office reviewing proposals for the foundation's expansion into affordable childcare centers. Her assistant knocked. "Miss Holland, Brett Morrison is here. He has an appointment." Grace looked up, surprised. He does. Yes, ma'am. 4 p.m. It's been on the calendar for 2 weeks. Grace pulled up her schedule. There it was. Brett Morrison. Employment inquiry. Send him in. Brett entered. Clean-shaven. Professional suit. Carrying a portfolio. Thank you for seeing me, he said. I didn't know I was seeing you. My assistant scheduled this. I called 6 times. Left voicemails. Finally, someone agreed to put me on your calendar. I think they thought I was someone else. Grace almost smiled. What do you want? Brett, a job. She stared at him. I've been working in marketing for the past 2 years. Small firms, getting my footing. I'm good at it. Really good. And I've been following the Holland Foundation's work, the housing initiative, the scholarship programs, the childcare centers you're planning. It's incredible work. He opened his portfolio. I put together a proposal for a marketing campaign, something that reaches the communities you're trying to serve. Not top-down charity messaging, ground level, authentic, community engagement. He slid the proposal across her desk. Grace flipped through it. It was good, genuinely good. Why, she asked. Because I want to do meaningful work. Because I'm good at this. Because I want to be a part of something bigger than myself. He paused. And because I want my kids to see their father do something worth respecting. Kids plural. Imama calls you mama, Brett said quietly. Jamie talks about you constantly. They're growing up watching you build something that matters. I want them to be proud of me too. Grace closed the portfolio. I'll have HR review this. If they think it has merit, you'll go through the standard interview process. No special treatment. You'll be judged like any other applicant. That's all I'm asking. Brett stood to leave. David, she said. He turned. This doesn't change anything between us. You understand that I do. Good. After he left, Grace opened the proposal again. Read it carefully. It was good. Very good. She buzzed her assistant. Send this to HR. Tell them I want it evaluated fairly. Yes, ma'am. Grace returned to her work. The proposals, the budgets, the endless decisions of running an empire. Outside her window, Manhattan glittered in the afternoon sun. She was Grace Holland, CEO, mother, survivor, builder, and she was finally truly free.